Okay, I guess we can start now. Thanks everyone for joining. Okay, perfect. Now it works. All right. Thanks for sorry for the delay again. All right. So today I'm introducing the Open Collaboration Tools project. You will hear exactly what it's all about later on. I won't give away too much earlier. We will talk about a bit more about the motivation first. But first off, actually, I'm Mark. So for those of you who don't know me, I work at Typefox. I'm a software engineer. We do DSL development, programming language development, IDE stuff, and so on. I'm also a lecturer with the Hamburg University of Applied Sciences. I do a lot of math. But for Typefox, I'm really mostly involved in open source. So I'm a project lead for the Eclipse Sphere project. I'm a project lead for the Eclipse Langham project as well. And I do a lot of maintenance and just overall healthiness of open source projects. And so what we're going to talk about today is engineering collaboration in general, especially when it comes to remote settings. Then what kind of toolings we have available so far. Then we're going to talk about some requirements that we, in particular, as Typefox had, and then as well the Open Collaboration Tools project, which you are here for. All right. So first off, the question, why to collaborate at all? And so there are a bunch of tools already that enable you to work collaboratively with one another in a remote environment, stuff like Confluence, School Docs, and whatever. And these are fairly nice because in traditional, older collaboration environments, well, actually, let me get it straight. These are very nice because you can work asynchronously or synchronously actually in any manner. You don't need to deal with kind of like merge conflicts like you need to deal with in Git, for example. And they're very nice to just work together on something, brainstorm something, or just work collaboratively in any manner. And so when it comes to collaboration in a software engineering environment, our use cases are kind of different. And so I see three main pillars of collaboration in software engineering. First off, we have brainstorming, right? So we develop a new feature, we want to re-architecture something, we want to architecture in a product or project in the first place. And so we come together, let's say in a live environment, and throw something at a whiteboard or whatever, and just see what sticks and work together on something new. Then the second use case is programming, or in particular oftentimes pair programming, which when I was still working in an office environment, I used fairly often, especially when it came to pair debugging as well, because oftentimes in a lot of cases you were so deep into the code in a lot of the cases that you couldn't really tell the forest through the trees. And so you couldn't see the wider picture oftentimes and were lost in your details and couldn't see, for example, that your debug configuration didn't work in the first place. And so having a second pair of eyes on the project or on the debugging session in particular was often fairly invaluable. And then also there's mentoring, which is fairly close to my heart. I mentioned that I'm a lecturer, and so I often deal with teaching people. And back when I was still in an office environment, I used to work with students. And, for example, in internships. And those, for example, didn't really know about Git or a lot of the other tooling that most software engineers are dealing with on a daily basis. And so having a moment to sit down with them and teach them the basics in a very chill and very lighthearted environment was very useful. And so getting all of that into a remote environment can be kind of difficult, especially when it comes to stuff like pair programming. We often had to deal with, I mean, everyone probably, if you're working in some sort of collaborative remote environment, that you have to deal with people misunderstanding what you just said, didn't really use the right button that you just meant to click or whatever. And so it can be fairly frustrating to work together remotely, especially. And so the big question is, how do we manage these use cases that are just outlined with a remote environment? And there are quite a few tools out there actually already that try to deal with that. Right, so for example, let's take Microsoft. If you've ever been using Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, you might be familiar with the Visual Studio LiveShare extension. And the extension basically enables most of that. So obviously you can share a workspace, you can share your code together with other software engineers, you can work collaboratively instantly. So whenever I change something in a file, it gets instantly reflected on all other peers in my group, for example. I can share all my local servers, I can share my terminals and whatever. And in an older version of LiveShare, I could even talk directly through the LiveShare extension. I believe they disabled that feature, but it's still fairly useful in general. And so LiveShare is a really good tool if you are able to use it. Unfortunately, it's not that easy, as in, for example, as mentioned, it's Visual Studio. So if you're not using Visual Studio or a derivative, or let's say a product of the Visual Studio family, like the official VS Code distribution, you're unable to use it, digital licensing, which is fine. But for example, for a lot of use cases, especially when it comes to the Eclipse ecosystem, where we're using Eclipse IDE, Eclipse Sphere, and so on, it's very difficult to use. And so there are a lot of startup approaches, actually, which try to take care of this as well. I've highlighted two of them, one of them being Code Together, which actually prides itself with being able to use most commonly used IDEs, which is very nice, actually. You can use it in Sphere as well. And then the Eclipse IDE, for example, as well. And then there's Duckly, which I believe is now defunct. I wasn't quite aware of this when making the slides, but I don't think they really exist anymore. Anyway, they try to have a few different unique selling points, like live sharing, like your webcam, and essentially being like an instant messaging tool inside of your IDE. And then obviously there are also quite a few open source approaches to this topic, to this problem. One of them, if you're already at the Eclipse con and here at the OCX, obviously we need to talk about the Eclipse Communication Framework, which is a collaborative editing environment or plugin for the Eclipse IDE. And it's actually fairly cool because it uses an open protocol called XMPP, which was used by Google Talk, for example. So you could log into Google Talk and just have all your contacts and could share your code with them. Unfortunately, Google Talk doesn't exist anymore as of 2 years ago. And I believe there's Jabber as well, which is using this, for example. Quite a few other tools where you can just log in and then use your existing contact list to actually share your code. Yeah, and then there's EtherSync, which is actually a fairly new project, or a fairly recent one, which is also using a very interesting approach, which is that it doesn't actually communicate through any server at all. Most of the programs or projects that we've been talking about actually using a lot of server infrastructure in order to leverage or facilitate all the collaboration. EtherSync doesn't use it at all, they just use the local network. And that could be fairly restricted in theory, but there are ways to extend the local network just beyond the local network, as in the physical layer. And so you can actually do quite a lot of that. And they're actually employing quite a lot of interesting technologies in there, like a service daemon, which we're going to talk about as well on a different slide. However, I've mentioned quite a few tools. It's a non-exhaustive list. There's quite a lot more, especially in the open source area. There are very specific tools for very specific use cases as well. Even when it comes to IDEs, and even beyond IDEs, there are a lot of tools that try to facilitate collaboration, especially when it comes to like web components and whatever. Like there's the Quill editor, for example, which has kind of like built-in collaboration and so on, but we're mostly concerned with like coding, right? And so when it comes to like our requirements as Typefox, and by proxy the customers that we're working with as well, we have a bunch of interesting new requirements that aren't really covered by the existing tools. And so, for example, we work a lot with Sphere, as I mentioned, and it's a project that is close to me as well. And so we have a lot of projects or customers with Sphere-based projects. And there are some projects or products that I mentioned that are capable of leveraging Sphere, but for example, this doesn't really work with my third point, for example, which I'm going to get to. And the second point actually is that there are a lot of customers actually that don't actually really use an IDE, but more like an IDE-like product. For example, a lot of you probably are aware that VS Code under the hood is using the Monaco editor, which is kind of like part of VS Code. And the Monaco editor actually is capable of being used as a standalone component in your web app, for example. It's fairly useful for a lot of stuff like the language server protocol and the language server support that you can get by using Monaco. However, we want, for example, a custom web app where we just embed Monaco and have the whole collaboration support as well. And actually nothing that we just showed or that we just talked about is capable of doing something like that. And then also beyond just code, there's a lot more use cases that we could have that require us to collaborate on code-like or IDE-like tools beyond just code. So stuff like graphical editors, which are quite common as well, and tools like Eclipse RCP-based applications, or even FIA-based applications, stuff like JSON forms or GLSP, for example, which go beyond just code, but actually show like a different representation of that, where you want to have collaboration support as well. And then there are on-premise customers, for example. Most of the tools that I showed you are actually not able to run on-premise or self-hosted applications. And so we have a lot of customers where security is really important, and they don't want their code to actually leave the network at all. And so we cannot really facilitate that with a lot of tools that we just talked about. To keep it short, I just created a small table. And so I'm listing here most of the tools that I just talked about. They're supported IDEs. And when it comes to extensibility in particular, which I talked about earlier, a lot of them are lacking. So actually only the Microsoft Live Share extension is really capable of supporting any kind of like IDE editor use case beyond just code. All of the others are like kind of very limited in that regard, explicitly saying that in their scope is only code-based editors. That's quite unfortunate. Then there are quite a lot of notable features. I mentioned them previously. A lot of them actually don't run on-premise. Stuff like Share that I personally used a bit, unfortunately, for example, doesn't. And there's also a licensing issue. For example, while the Eclipse communication framework uses EPR, which kind of makes sense, there are a lot of other projects which aren't really capable of being used like in a really corporate environment. For example, when it comes to Ethersync, it's AGPL. That's a very copyleft license, so it's really difficult to use it in a corporate environment, especially if you want to adjust it or make modifications to it, because you need to open source them all, which might not be a problem for everyone, but for some. And then, for example, the LiveShare extension now I talked about, even though it's free, you can use it completely free. You need to use it with an official Microsoft product, so it's kind of difficult to use it in a lot of our settings that we are using it. And so what we need is something that I'm going to introduce specifically, which actually attempts to support most or all the IDEs somehow, is ideally infinitely extensible, is capable of running on-premise or as self-hosted, and ideally uses something like a free open source license. All right, so now the Open Collaboration Tool project actually comes in, and I actually had to update my slides fairly recently for that as well, because by now it's the Eclipse Open Tools project. So we actually got the confirmation last week that this is now an official Eclipse project. So yeah, now the Eclipse Open Collaboration Tools project enables you to, or will enable you to use most of the IDEs that are out there to collaborate with one another. Okay, but before actually getting to the tools project itself, there's one more slide I want to show you. So recently, starting with like 2016, 2017, there are a lot of IDE protocols on there, and they really made our lives easier, like as tool developers. Because, for example, the language server protocol, which probably a lot of you are quite familiar with, being used, for example, like for VS Code extensions and whatever, in order to facilitate language support for a lot of IDEs, really helped make the make the environment for developing language servers, or rather not necessarily language servers, but language services for any kind of IDE much easier. Because previously you kind of needed like specifically Java support for Eclipse, you need specifically Java support for IntelliJ and whatever, and now you can just plug in an LSP and be kind of done with it, because you just need a small GUI layer to a specific IDE, and then you get all the language support kind of in an isolated container, essentially. And we have something similar with debuggers as well, so the same idea applies, essentially. We have a bit of glue code for each of those runtimes, and then we get the same benefit out of it. And actually there's something that exists for quite a few years actually, but I've been just made aware of fairly recently, which is the build server protocol, supported for like build tools like Maven and Gradle, which is supported by a few IDEs as well. And yeah, these have made our jobs tremendously easier actually. And so why not use kind of the same idea? Why not use a protocol to actually support collaboration as well? So this is where the Open Collaboration Tools protocol, or OCP in short, comes in. So we kind of try to write a small GUI layer for any IDE and just connect them to one another in a very simple way. I mean, this is obviously a very convoluted slide, but I just want to show really any IDE. And technically, this is actually really simple. So what we just try to do is we get everyone kind of in a room together, like in a session, and we have one host that shares their workspace. That is kind of the source of truth, right? They have all the workspace, they have all the workspace files specifically, and they're able to share them. They share their terminal and whatever, so people are able to actually code on that, write tests, or run tests specifically, build the tool and whatever, and everyone else is basically just seeing a copy of them. And on a technical level, this is essentially just peer-to-peer with an added broadcasting mechanism. So everyone can communicate with one another, and everything, at least in our protocol, is completely peer-to-peer encrypted. So even if you, for some reason, get hold of a message meant for someone else, you can't actually read it. So it's fairly nice. All right. And actually, to facilitate the peer-to-peer connection, we're actually using a server instance in between all of the users. And the server instance actually acts just as a generic message exchange service. So, for example, I just send a broadcast to the server, and the server has the instruction to just send the message to everyone else in the room. Fairly simple. And so the server is actually in charge just of creating and being able to join sessions as kind of like, for example, a signaling server in WebRTC. There are quite a few, for example, collaboration projects which are actually using WebRTC directly, and that's fairly useful, but we decided to build our own small collaboration server as HTTP based. And I mentioned that we want people to run this in their own environment, in their own local networks. They should be able to run it themselves. And so in order to kind of facilitate kind of any authorization or whatever, you can just plug in any auth provider or auth Google, GitHub, whatever you want, essentially, Keycloak or something like that. And in the end, all that needs to be done on the client side is essentially just update the logic. So for example, the host says, well, I've just updated file A, please everyone just display file now in your editor. Or I just added like a line, I removed the line, I just changed the word, just update that. So ideally that should be fairly simple. And for that, we actually already started working on 2 clients, but we actually finished our initial implementation of 2 clients in particular. So one of them being essentially a showcasing VS Code extension, which you can obviously install in any application that actually supports VS Code extensions. So VS Code itself, VS Codium, online workspace providers like Gitpod, Coder, GitHub Codespaces, for example, as well. And then one of our initial use cases, especially for the Open Collaboration Protocol, was always FEAR. And so we worked for a long time on a FEAR integration, or rather a FEAR extension, which isn't a VS Code extension, but it's kind of similar. But it's compile time, so it gets even deeper integration than a VS Code extension for Get, for example. And so we are able to leverage more features of FAIR. We are able to not only build it into our own FAIR IDE, for example, but also make it available in all FAIR-based applications. And so you have very easy access to just extend upon it. If you have the custom editor in FAIR, you can just build a new hook, essentially, into the integration, and then just add your own custom messages into the protocol in order to support your new editor. So ideally, that should be fairly simple. And so this whole project is fairly new, right? And so we are planning a lot as well. I don't have a whole roadmap, but what we can show already is that we have a bunch of IDEs planned already. I talked about IDE-like applications previously. And so the Monaco editor is obviously quite an interesting target for us. I use the VS Code icon because Monaco doesn't have their own, but you should get what I'm getting at. And this is supposed to enable all kinds of collaboration and all kinds of web applications, ideally. And that's something we're currently actively working on that will hopefully be finished soon. And then something that we are actively planning to do are integrations into popular Java-based IDEs, like the Eclipse IDE or the JetBrains-based products like IntelliJ and so on. And those will be implemented via the open collaboration service process. I talked about the service daemon that EtherSync is using, which is quite really a cool technique, actually, which is written in Rust, so it's portable to any kind of OS. And then any AE can just hook into it. And we're using something very similar. We will use the same technology that we use to integrate everything into FAIR and VS Code, and just encapsulate that into a node process, and then run that from Eclipse, from JetBrains products, to enable the same kind of thing with just a bit of glue code. All right. And now I have a bit of time actually to show a quick demo of that, because, well, I talked a lot, and while there's not much to show for collaboration, because it's just magically changing files, I can do a quick demo of that anyway. All right. So I have two VS Code instances running here. I could have used FAIR, but it's slightly easier to set up in VS Code. So I have a FAIR project, or the FAIR project actually open in one instance. The other instance is actually just empty. And so I have the small open collaboration button in here. And I can either choose to create or join an existing session, obviously create a new one. And now I have a small session code that I can copy and just enter it in the second session, or in the second open editor. All right. While it's waiting to accept, or rather, while it's waiting for me to accept, it will display a message about that, and then it will rather quickly actually load the whole workspace, and we can see that everything is kind of there. I can just open the package.json that exists in the root of the project, and nothing of that is kind of copied. It's just being transmitted just in time. So when I request the package.json file, I get it from the host of the workspace of the host, and I can actually start following the host, for example, and see what they're doing live right now. Okay, so it instantly opens the file on my second editor. I can just see where the host is currently located. For example, I see what they're targeting in the code editor. I can immediately see what they're kind of doing. So as in, I'm just changing a bunch of code, and immediately the changes get reflected on both editors. And obviously this works the same way on the opposite direction as well. So all users right now, at least, are kind of able to do the same things. Eventually, you might want to kind of lock down your workspace. For example, if you are not sure who you're actually inviting right now, so you might want to make it read-only. That's something we're working on as well. But right now, it's actually just a fairly simple sharing mechanism. And so this is mostly for text right now, but we're actively working on more integrations, stuff like notebook support as well, or eventually more interesting things like more custom editors, for example. Okay, yeah, that's it, kind of, for a demo. Before coming to questions, or maybe if you have questions later as well, come to our booth. It's like at the end of the hall. And now, yeah, let's talk. All right.
Thank you. I have two questions. You mentioned that when you request a package, you get it like instantly. Does this mean, I mean, you actually have to transfer code from the host to the other, to the receivers, or do the receivers have to have the project that you want to work on already on their disks?
So, good question. They don't. So some projects actually attempt to, for example, copy the whole workspace so they can work locally and offline on it. But in our case, actually, you have a consistent connection, and you don't need anything at all on your system. Actually, you can, and maybe that's an example I could have shown as well, or actually I can show. For example, there's this VS Code web. Give me a second. VS Code dev environment, where you can just open VS Code as a simple website. It doesn't have a backend or any kind of server. It just hosts the front end. And you can actually connect to the Open Collaboration server running on my machine, which doesn't work. All right, it's a local environment, so it doesn't work right now. But to answer your question quickly, no, you don't have to have anything on your system. It actually just loads it just in time as you open the file.
Okay, so that means that when the receiver or when the host closes the session, the receivers will probably also lose all the code, or what they don't have to bother about cleaning up or something like that.
Yeah, right now, so everything that wasn't saved actually will be lost eventually, because so essentially once the guest that lost connection will close the workspace, everything will be lost. Yeah, that's one of the consequences of that design.
And the other question is, I didn't get it if maybe you said it, but is it right now is only reading, or is it possible for the guests to also write code and send it back to the host?
Okay,
to actually code together.
Yeah, that's definitely possible. And I mentioned it's fairly difficult to see, because if you have just two editors side by side, it's difficult to tell who is actually coding right now. So this editor, like the one you see on the left, is the guest. And so I can just go ahead, remove this, and it will be removed everywhere. And so, yeah, everyone is kind of completely, has equal rights, essentially, as everyone is able to delete any file. They can also create a new file, for example, call it test.txt. And for some reason it took an error, but it should create the file anyway. Yeah, okay. And so I can do anything with the workspace that I want. I can't execute any code yet because there's no terminal sharing support, but I can write any code, create any file, delete any file actually. So it could be a fairly destructive action actually. But aside from that, yeah.
Well, you did say you may want to put it in the read-only mode. So
exactly.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
And you mentioned also that debugging can be shared as well, yeah? It will be some UI sharing, or because it's not about editing anymore, it's about actions in the whole IDE?
Yes, so that's something that isn't working currently, as in it's currently out of scope, as in we're still working on things actively, but it's definitely in our scope of our project, and we definitely want to support that eventually. It's not one of our main inspirations, and I've talked about that earlier, was the LiveShare extension, which basically all has those features, right? You can share a local server instance, you can debug together, you can share a terminal and so on, and eventually we want to get those in as well, because, well, we don't want Microsoft to have anything we don't.
Okay, and one more question. You mentioned it's Eclipse project now. Does it mean the specification is also open now, and if not, what are the plans for it?
Yes, so the specification isn't like specifically spec'd out right now. It's more like that we have a reference implementation right now that we will eventually, once it's kind of matured, pour into like formally or well-documented spec or protocol specification, like similar to the LSP, for example. Right now it's fairly fluid, and so we don't want to put in the work if we have to change it every month. But eventually, if you want to write a specific line for something like more obscure IDEs. I don't know. BlueJ, for example, a popular IDE for students for Java. You can use that protocol eventually for yourself and just develop that.
Okay, maybe last question. You mentioned it will be extensible, so it supports text now, will support like more action, and then, for example, for diagramming, it will be some reference diagramming sharing part of protocol, something like this, yeah?
Yeah. So the protocol itself just features messages, which are very abstract in its design, essentially. And so you can just define new messages saying, for example, for the specific graphical editor, for example, I want to share an update with everyone. And so I'm sending a broadcast message just saying, hey, I've just updated something. And for example, I removed an edge between two nodes in a graph. And everyone else is supposed to follow that information and just keep track of everything that's happened. And so you're able to just add new messages. And we use this mechanism to essentially build the default spec, but you're free, similar to the LSP protocol, to just extend upon it like you like.
Thanks.
Does it work with the VS Code SSH remote sessions?
I haven't tried it, but it should. I don't see why not.
Okay, nice.
That's actually a question right behind you.
Yeah, if I understand correctly, Typefox is currently running a kind of demo server, so you can try this out. Is there some plan on having a public service in the future? That's legit, right? Like, long
Are
term?
you insinuating our service isn't legit?
No, I'm not saying, but you probably don't want to do this forever for the whole world for free, right? Or
Yes. So right now we do, Typefox hosts a public server instance. That's completely right. We have very simple terms of use. Ideally, just use it for testing and public open source work. We don't take any liability for anything that happens. If some code gets exposed, that's on you. And so eventually, we probably want to give the server over to the Eclipse Foundation so they can host it. They can take care of all the security-related stuff that we don't really know about at all. So ideally, things should be taken over by the Eclipse Foundation eventually, similar to, for example, what we did with OpenVSX in the past.
I've got two questions, and the first question would be, is it also possible for the guests to, for example, make a commit? So will also be the .git folder be shared, or like hidden folders?
Hidden folders are shared. The Git folder should be shared as well, if I'm correct.
Because that would be interesting, because maybe you've got
Yeah, the feature exists in VS Code as far as I know. We probably want to support that eventually. I believe VS Code is using some kind of specific API for that we should have access to as well. So not right now, but we will get to it probably.
Okay, thank you. And the second question, you told us that you plan some other extensions, for example, for IntelliJ or for the Eclipse IDE. Do you've got a rough time plan, a timeline for it, when this will be available?
Nothing very specific, as in we don't want to box ourselves into something, and it depends on some availabilities. I mean, right now at least, this is all kind of open source. We don't really benefit from it at all, but probably something during the next half a year, likely.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We're right on time, so thanks a lot for attending my talk, and see you everyone. And please visit our booth.